Hey, good morning. How we doing? All right, let's go. 8 a.m. I like it. Well, hey, my name is Chris Cummings. I'm the lead pastor here at Doxa. And if today's your first day with us, man, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for trusting us with your Sunday morning. We do hope and pray that this place will feel like home for you very easily. On your way in, you should receive a program. Looks like this. On one side is a list of announcements. At the bottom of that section is a connect card. And if today is your first day with us, we would love the opportunity to connect with you and to help you get connected as well. And one of the best ways for us to be able to do that is for you to fill out that card. Once you fill it out, you can do one of two things with it. You can either put it in the offering baskets when they get passed later on in the service, or you can take it to our connections lobby right when you first walk in and exchange it for a free gift. And so again, we are incredibly glad that you are here. As we gather today, we are continuing in the series that we launched last week, and this series is focusing on the topic of generosity. And as we jumped into this series last week, one of the things that we said was that the reason why we're doing this series is not because we want something from you, but rather we want something for you. That it's inevitable that every single one of us, that our hearts are prone towards greed, that no one drifts towards generosity, we always drift towards greed. And so what we talked about last week as we kicked off this series is just the reality of greed and our desperate need for generosity. That the only antidote to greed, the only that will kill that idol in our life, is radical biblical generosity. And as we approach this series together, we've creatively titled this series, Jesus on Generosity, because what we're doing is we're gonna look at the different teachings of Jesus and see, what does Jesus have to say about how we use our money? What does he have to say about generosity? And what's interesting is that when it comes to the teachings of Jesus, Jesus teaches oftentimes on this topic. In fact, Jesus teaches more on the topic of money than on the topic of heaven and hell combined. This is one of the most popular topics that Jesus teaches on. And here's what's fascinating. Whenever Jesus teaches on the topic of generosity, what we find throughout all the Gospels is that Jesus seems to be far more focused and far more concerned about the heart of the giver rather than the amount of the gift. He is far more concerned about the heart of the giver than he is the amount of the gift. And here's the thing, why would he be concerned about the amount of the gift, right? Like, God is the richest being in the entire universe, and it's not even close, right? Like, it's not even close. The Bible tells us that God is so rich that first and foremost, he owns all of it. That everything is in the palm of his hands. That everything belongs to him. That he is the sovereign owner over everything, and that you and I, that we are just managers and stewards of what God has entrusted to us. He owns it all. And by all, we're talking about everything on the earth and everything beyond the earth. The dude literally owns the moon. That's rich, okay? But not only that, but if there was something that God did not own, hypothetically, he is so rich in power that all he has to do is speak and he would get it. That is infinite wealth. Like, imagine if you had that kind of power for a second, right? Like, imagine if you could say, let there be a Ferrari, and then you had a Ferrari, you would not need a job, okay? I'd be like, college student, that degree, just stop. Like, you're good, right? But that's the reality for God, is that his wealth is infinite. And what we see in the teachings of Jesus, that he is far more focused on the heart of the giver rather than the amount of the gift. And whenever we see Jesus come and do his earthly ministry and die on the cross for you and for me, what we see time and time again is that what he's after is not your money. What he is after is your heart. The reason he dies for us, rises from the grave, is because he wants your heart. That's what he's after. He's after our hearts. And what we're gonna see as we continue in this series is we're gonna see very much the heart of generosity. And what does it truly mean for us to surrender ourselves fully to the Lord. And so if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open up to the Gospel of Matthew. We're gonna be in chapter 6 together today, looking at verses 19 through 24. If you don't have a Bible with you, we'll have the verses on the screen behind me so you can easily follow along. And if you don't own a Bible, like a physical copy of God's Word, we love to give you one. You can visit our hospitality kiosk or our Connections lobby before you leave today and pick up a free copy for yourself. Matthew chapter 6, we're gonna start in verse 19, but as you're turning there, here's where we are in Matthew's gospel. Where we are is kind of right in the middle of Jesus's most famous sermon, his Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus at this moment is sitting on this mountainside. There's this crowd that comes around him, and he's teaching this crowd. And what he's predominantly doing is he's teaching them really kind of what does it look like to live within the kingdom of God. But the reality is that when we put our faith in Jesus, what saves us is not our works, but whenever we put our faith in Jesus, that it inevitably changes us. It changes our behavior. It changes our works. And so what Jesus is doing is he's just using this time to teach about the kingdom of heaven and how contrary that is to the reality of the world. And as he's doing this, he's talking about these different subjects. And right here, right in the middle of his sermon, he starts talking about money and specifically our relationship with it. This is what he says starting in verse 19. He says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." As Jesus starts to teach on the topic of money and our relationship with money, what we see is that Jesus focuses in on where our treasure is found. See, what Jesus doesn't do here, he doesn't tell us not to have treasure. He tells us to have treasure. He says, lay up for yourselves treasure. He wants us to have treasure. The big concern for Jesus is where is it located? That's his predominant concern. And the reason why Jesus is so concerned about where your treasure is found is because wherever your treasure is found, that is where your heart will be. Whatever gets your money will inevitably get your heart. And because God is concerned about our heart and is after our heart, that's a concern for Jesus. He wants to know where our treasure is found because that is inevitably where our heart will be. And as Jesus lays before us where our treasure can be found, he gives us just two possibilities of where it can be found. That it is either treasure on earth or it is treasure in heaven. Those are the two possibilities. And as Jesus continues to talk about these things, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly where he has a preference for us to find our treasure. In fact, from the very beginning, he tells us what not to do. He says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Like, don't find your treasure there. And the reason why Jesus tells us not to lay up treasures for ourselves on earth is because these treasures will inevitably fade. That every single earthly treasure has an expiration date to it. And he tells us that one of two things is going to be the outcome to the treasures that we have on earth. It will either get destroyed, like rust and decay, or it will become someone else's possession. But inevitably, at some point, it will no longer be ours. Every single earthly possession that we come across has an expiration date, right? I mean, just think about what's filled in our museums today, right? Like in every single museum is some sort of valuable artifact that used to be a treasure to someone that now is in a museum somewhere else, right? I remember our family was in Chicago last Thanksgiving, and while we were in Chicago, we went to the Chicago Science and Industry Museum, which is like a really awesome museum. And while we were there, we're kind of looking around, and we saw these signs that said that there was this submarine exhibit. And I'm like, that sounds incredibly cool. Like, let's go check out the submarine exhibit. And so we're walking down this long, windy hallway. We're seeing pictures of subs. I'm like, this is cool. And then all of a sudden, that hallway feeds you into this giant open room. And in this room is a submarine, like a full-on submarine. Like, not like part of a sub. I'm talking the whole thing. And as soon as we see that, I'm like, this is wild. And this is where my mind immediately goes. I'm immediately like, how did they fit that like through the door? Like they build the building around this? This is insane. And then what you begin to learn is as you continue to walk through the exhibit that the submarine in that building is not an American sub. It's a German World War II submarine that the US Navy captured in the middle of World War II and now is on display. That sub used to belong to the German army, used to belong to the German Navy. Now it's in a museum in Chicago. That's wild. Nothing that we own will be ours forever. You can own a submarine and it'll be in a museum at some point, right? Nothing that is ours will be ours forever. Every earthly treasure will inevitably fade. They all have an expiration date. And so what Jesus does is he tells us, hey, don't store up your treasure there. It's gonna fade. And what he does instead is he gives us a far better alternative. He says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. Instead, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, because the treasures in heaven, these treasures never fade. Now, here's the question for us in light of that. What on earth are treasures in heaven, right? Like it's easy for us, I think, to kind of understand treasures on earth. Like we get that. Like we got physical things in our hand. We own things. Like that's not hard for us to understand. We get that. But what on earth does Jesus mean about these treasures in heaven? And even more than that, how can we, earthly people, store up for ourselves these heavenly treasures? Well, first, that word treasure literally means like monetary things, like money and jewels, rewards. That's what that word literally means. And whenever Jesus' disciples heard this from Jesus, that's where their mind would have gone to, that there are heavenly jewels, heavenly crowns, heavenly rewards. And that is certainly the case. We see that all throughout the scriptures, so that there is rewards for us in heaven. Now, we don't know exactly how those things take form and all that kind of stuff. That's still kind of a mystery to us in a lot of ways. But here's what we do know. We do know the purpose of those rewards. You see, the way Jesus frames up these heavenly treasures and these earthly treasures is as if these two things are the complete opposites of each other. And so if we want to understand the purpose of heavenly treasures, all we got to do is see what's the opposite of earthly treasures. And what is the purpose of an earthly treasure? Well, earthly treasures, its purpose is for us to enjoy earthly pleasures. That's why we store them up. And so that we can enjoy more of these earthly things, these worldly things. We invest in earthly treasures to enjoy earthly pleasures. And so if heavenly treasures is the opposite of earthly treasures, then that means that the heavenly treasures that God gives us is for the purpose of enjoying what? Heavenly pleasures. And what is the pleasures of heaven? It's God, right? It's intimacy with him. Like what makes heaven heaven in the first place? It's the fact that God is there. What makes heaven heaven is not simply the fact that there's no more pain. It's not the absence of pain or the absence of sin that makes heaven heaven. It's the presence of God. He is what makes heaven heaven. And so these heavenly treasures are given for us to enjoy more heavenly pleasures, specifically for us to enjoy more of the fullness of God. The very thing that can satisfy our souls. That unlike these earthly treasures that lead to earthly pleasures that can't actually satisfy, these heavenly treasures lead us to heavenly pleasures that can satisfy us. It leads us deeper into intimacy with God. Now, in light of that, the next question is this: how do we obtain these kind of heavenly treasures? Right? Because like we're earthly people. Like we're not in heaven yet. And so how do we obtain these kind of things? Well, again, it's the opposite of how we obtain earthly treasures. So if we obtain earthly treasures through the means of accumulating wealth and gaining for ourselves, then that must mean that the way that we get and receive heavenly treasures is not by accumulating, but by distributing. That it's not by gaining, it's by giving. And we see that elsewhere in Jesus' teaching. Look at Luke chapter 12, for example. It says, "Fear not, little flock, For it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Here what we see in Luke 12 is a lot of clarity and this connection between generosity and these heavenly treasures. And the way Jesus frames this up is that the way we obtain these heavenly treasures is by using earthly possessions for heavenly purposes. That it's not by gaining, but rather it's by giving. And that for the Christian, the more that we give of these earthly treasures, the more of these heavenly treasures we get to enjoy. The more of God we get to know. The more of earth I lose, the more of heaven I get. That's the idea that we get here. In fact, just think about this for a moment. Think about the day when all of your earthly possessions are finally gone and no more. Specifically, the day that you die. On that day, you will not have any more earthly possessions whatsoever. It will all be gone. And how does the Bible describe our outcome on that day? It's with gain. Philippians chapter 1 says, for me to live is Christ and to die is what? Gain. It's not loss. It's gain that we get. On the day when every single earthly treasure and possession is no more, what the Bible describes is on that day, you will not look at the outcome and say, oh, what a loss. But that on that day, you'll say, what a gain. Because what I get is more of God himself. It's more of the pleasures of heaven. And so what Jesus does here is he opens this up, as he tells us where to invest. He says you can invest in the things of this world, they will never satisfy and they will always fade. Or you can invest in the things of heaven. You can use your possessions, you can use your money for heavenly purposes. And what that's gonna lead you to is more heavenly treasures that lead to heavenly pleasures, and that's more of the intimacy that we get to have with God. And he tells us in this moment where to invest. And the reason why Jesus, again, is so concerned with this is because wherever we make that kind of investment, that is inevitably where our hearts will be. See, our heart follows our investments. They always do. Just think about for a moment if you invest in certain stocks, right? That as you invest in those stocks, your heart follows in that pursuit. In other words, you check that every single day, right? In our household, we're investing in a handful of stocks. Kristen, my wife, kind of does that thing. I don't know how stocks work. She does, which is great. I'm really proud of her for figuring that out. And every day she'll tell me how it's doing, and it won't mean anything to me. I have no idea what she is talking about. But what happens is that we invest in those things, it inevitably leads our heart in that direction. What gets our money will get our heart. And what Jesus is concerned about here is wherever we make that investment, that's where our heart is going. And so the question for us is to simply look at our treasures and ask ourselves, where do we find our treasures? Because wherever we find our treasure to be, that is where we will find our hearts. So let me just ask you, how are you spending your money? What is it pointed towards? Because whatever it's pointed towards is inevitably telling us where our heart actually is. It's leading us in that direction. And I think for many of us, we would say that God is our greatest treasure and our supreme prize. We would say that with our words, but our wallet would say something completely different. And for many of us, I think that's where we're at. And the reason why we're not investing our resources in heavenly treasures is because greed has blinded us to heavenly realities. Look at verse 22 and 23. It says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Right in the middle of Jesus' discourse on money and our relationship with money, all of a sudden Jesus starts talking about the eye. And it feels like a really odd transition here for a moment. But what Jesus is telling us is that the eye is what brings light into the soul. It illuminates our heart, that it's the lamp to the body. And he tells us that in light of that, if you have a bad eye, you're gonna be walking around in darkness. But if you have a good eye, a healthy eye, then you'll be able to see clearly. And here's what's fascinating. That word healthy that we see here in this passage, in the original Greek language, also has another meaning. And that other meaning is single-mindedness. It's the idea of an undivided heart. And what Jesus is telling us here is that whenever we have our hearts aimed at God, that it's God-oriented and not divided amongst other things, that inevitably it also leads our hearts. See, what Jesus recognizes here is that whatever captivates our eyes' attention will ultimately consume our heart's affection. Whatever captivates our eyes' attention will ultimately consume our heart's affection. And so what we find is that when it comes to our relationship with money, that whatever we invest in, that's leading our heart in that direction, while at the same time, our heart is leading our investments. To go back to the investment analogy of stocks for a minute, right? The reason why anyone invests in any sort of stock is simply this. It's because you believe that that stock has value. And then not only that, but if you were to invest in it, that it will bring you a rate of return that is profitable for you. That's why you invest. And what Jesus is telling us here is that when our eyes are oriented on the things of this world, he's like, it's as if our soul is darkened. And we've begun to believe into the deceitfulness of greed. We've begun to believe that these earthly things can satisfy, they can bring everlasting joy, that they can bring the happiness that I've been craving all this time. But when our eyes are set on that direction, that we're walking in darkness, that we're blind to the true heavenly realities. But then he tells us if our eyes can be focused on Christ and on heavenly things, as if the blinds of our soul are just opened up and the light of the world is now penetrating to the depths of our hearts so that we can see clearly, that we can see the lies of greed, that we can see the beauty and the worth of heaven. And for many of us, I think what's happening in our lives is that our hearts have been so consumed with the things of this world that it's blinded us to heavenly realities. And because our hearts are blinded to heavenly realities, we're not making heavenly investments. Which means that for many of us, the first step for us is just to turn our gaze upon heaven, turn our gaze to Christ. Just like the hymn that we just sang at the tail end of that song, that we turn our eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and then notice the outcome. It says, and the things of this earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Why do the things of this world grow strangely dim? It's because nothing in this world compares to the glory of God. Like you're holding up a candle to the sun. It doesn't compare. And whenever our gaze and our eyes are set on Christ, we begin to see things in a new perspective. Whenever we set our attention on heavenly realities, the light of the world comes into our heart and it illuminates our heart and it pushes back the darkness, and we begin to see just how valuable and worthy this God really is. And so what Jesus is telling us here is he's telling us, man, where are we putting our investments in? Where is our heart in the midst of all of this? What are our eyes focused on? And what he's ultimately building up to is simply this: what is it that we trust? What is it that we are making our God? What do we worship? And that's how he ends. Look at verse 24. It says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. At the end of this section on money and our relationship with it, Jesus leads us to this place where we begin to really look for ourselves of who is it that we actually serve? What has become our true master? What is it that we worship? Is it God or is it money? And what I want you to notice here is the way that Jesus frames this up is he tells us you can't do both. And so often in our life, what we think is we think that we can do both. Like we think that as long as we give God the majority of ourselves, then we're good. So we say, I'm gonna give God 80% of myself, 70% of myself. I'll give God 98% of myself. I'm gonna hold on to these other 2%. But here's what Jesus is clearly telling us. God's not interested in part of you. He's not interested in the majority of you. He wants all of you, every ounce, all of it. But so often what we do is we give him part of us, but not all of us, and we hold on to other things. And here's the way that I see this play out oftentimes, especially when it comes to money and resources. The way I see this play out often is we'll say things like this: I'll give God my time, but I won't give God my money. God, you can have my time, I'll give that to you, but I'm gonna hold on to this for myself. And then what we tend to do is we tend to justify that perspective so that we can rationalize it in our mind. And so here's what we do after that. After we make that kind of dichotomy and say, God, you can have this, I'm gonna hold on to this, we then justify it by saying something like this to ourselves. We inevitably end up saying, well, my time is more valuable than my money, and so God's really getting the best, it's okay. And we begin to justify that. And I'm just here to tell you, God's not interested in your time and not your money. He's also not interested in your money and not your time. He doesn't want part of you or the majority of you. He wants all of you. And Jesus tells us clearly that you can't have your heart divided in this way, because here's what will inevitably happen. You will end up with these two masters. You will end up either loving one and end up hating the other. And here's how that plays out. The way that plays out is not typically, okay, well, I'm investing a lot in money and my own personal gain. Therefore, I'm never gonna come to God, turning my back on him, hate him, shutting him out. That's typically not the way it plays out. See, the way this plays out in our life is this: whichever of these two things you make your master, you will automatically try to make the other your servant. That's how it gets played out. You see, if I make God my master, then money becomes my servant. Money doesn't rule over me, it doesn't master over me. I master over it, I rule over it. It's my servant. I use it for the purposes in which I choose. And what purposes do I choose when God's my master? It's for his glory. When God's my master, money becomes my servant, and my money serves the purpose of glorifying my master. But when you flip that, when money becomes your master, here's what you will inevitably try to do. You will try to make God your servant. And what that means is not that you don't stop coming to him. You keep coming to him. But you don't come to him because you're like, God, I want more of you. I want more intimacy with you. I want to know you deeper. That's not why you come. Why you come is because you want something from God. Specifically, you want whatever God can give you. And so we come to God asking for him to bless our efforts and to give us more resources and to make these more earthly deposits into our account. That's why we come to him. It's not to get more of the giver, it's to get more of the gifts the giver can give. And whenever we make money our master, we will inevitably try to make God our servant. And here's the reality: money makes a terrible God. Money makes a great servant. It's a phenomenal servant. It can do so many things. It can send missionaries across the world. It can give resources to translate the Bible into other languages. Money is a phenomenal servant. It's an awful God. And what Jesus does is he lays these things before us. And then what Jesus does is he just kind of moves on to the next topic. And the reason why is what Jesus is doing at the end of this passage is he's holding up a mirror to our lives, and he's basically asking us this question: who are we going to serve? Who are we going to let be the master over our lives? Who are we going to serve? You're going to serve something. The question is who? And my prayer and my plea for us today is that we surrender ourselves fully to the Lord. Money makes a terrible God. Phenomenal servant, terrible God. And my hope and prayer for us as we continue to journey through this series is that we will surrender ourselves fully to this God. Not part of us, not the majority of us, but every single ounce of us, that we will lay it at the feet of Jesus.